What's going on, my grass gangers? It is your boy Mustard Gameathon here, and today, oh my god, we're just sitting here so hype about this dang Trevenant release. I'm gonna throw out what I think are gonna be kind of where all the Pokemon lie after all of the buffs, after all the nerfs, and after the addition of Trevenant. Starting with Absol, I think Absol's pretty decent. He's a solid jungler for sure. He's really good at ganking early game. He falls off late game though, which is where he's a little weak. In those late game team fights, he's not really able to contribute all that much. I would say as far as speedsters go and characters in general, I would say he's probably a mid-tier. Absol isn't all that bad. I think he's great early game. He's a great jungler. Next we got Blastoise, and Blastoise has had an interesting career in Unite, going from super OP when he first came out to being a very admirable defense boy. I think he has a lot of great moves in his kit. I think his ult is great. I love his ability to just move the opponent around with stuff like Hydro Pump and Surf, and I think he's really solid. I would say that he is probably one of the better defenders. I'll slap Blasty in A. I think he's really solid. I don't think there's too much that can go wrong with picking a good Blasty on your team. Blissey, I love Blissey so much. Blissey is a ton of fun to play, but I just think Blissey just is missing a lot to her kit. She's probably the least viable support character. Can potentially be really nasty paired with a really good team that knows how to really capitalize on what Blissey is doing, but when you don't have that, Blissey really falls off. Blissey is probably the character that can do the least by herself. I think C is where she belongs because she's just probably the lowest tier support character, as unfortunate as it is to say. Next we go on to Charizard. Charizard got a big buff in his ability to continue moving while using his basic attacks, and Flamethrower and Fire Blast. So he's able to keep moving while throwing out moves and basic attacks. So Charizard is kind of nutty. His range on his ult got extended, which is great. His ult is already super powerful, so having a little bit more reach on it is kind of nutty. I would say Charizard is probably a solid A tier now. I don't think he's going to be overpowered, but I think those little buffs that they gave him to his just ability to keep being mobile while using his moves, I think that's really going to help him out. He's always been fun. He's always had a good kit, but I think this will be enough to put him kind of on par with the other all-arounders that are typically seen as super powerful. Next, we got Cinderace, and Cinderace, I think he's in a pretty good spot. He's a pretty consistently performing attacker. I think he's a solid A. Can't really go wrong with the Cinderace in jungle or something like that. He performs pretty well. He does a lot of damage. Next, though, we got Cramorant, and I was really hoping a Cramorant buff was coming in this patch, and unfortunately it did not. I would say he's probably the least viable attacker, unfortunately. His kit is cool. I really like his kit, and it can work really well. I just think he needs a little bit more to his kit to be all that viable. Crammy might be one of the lower tier characters, I have to say. Whenever there's a Cramorant on an enemy team, it's not really all that threatening. I feel like it's one of those just Pokemon that you see on an enemy team and it's like, oh, okay, they're putting themselves at a disadvantage, I see. Next we go on to Krusty. Pretty low tier also, I would say. I think he is probably the least viable defender. I don't really know if I would say D. I'll say D. I'm sorry, Krusty. You're very sweet. You're a very sweet boy. Russell is just kind of in a tough spot right now. I think he needs some buffs. He might not quite be D, but I feel like he's probably the lowest tier defender for sure. Next we go on to Decidueye, and Decidueye has had a nice glow up. I've played a few games with him, and Decidueye's damage output is kind of insane now. With Razor Leaf, you're just doing obscene amounts of damage, and now Spirit Shackle can stack up to 3 times, so he can really play into that sniper role, and his ult has been buffed as well. So Decidueye is kind of primed to start popping off a little bit. I could definitely see him moving up to A tier. I don't know if he'll still be able to compete with Pokemon like Greninja, like Cinderace, but I think his kit now is setting him up to potentially come up to be at least almost as viable as them. Next we go on to Dragonite. Dragonite, most likely the undisputed best Mon before this patch. He was just wreaking havoc with that Hyper Beam, Dragon Dance build. It was just nutty. He was tearing through objectives with that Hyper Beam. But now with the nerf to his Hyper Beam build and a nerf to his ult, he is going to be a little bit less overpowered, I guess you could say. He is still going to be pretty good, I think. I think there's a lot of stuff in his kit that is still really solid. Hyper Beam is still going to be a great damage dealer paired with the Dragon Dance. So I would say he's probably still going to be a solid A tier. I don't think Dragonite's really going anywhere. I think he isn't going to be as overpowered as he was, but I think he's still going to be a pretty solid character. He might still even be S tier. I don't know. Next, we go on to my cotton baby Eldegoss, my personal main, and I would say Eldegoss is probably the best support. I'm trying not to speak too biased here about her, but I do think Eldegoss is the best support just on based on like competitively how she performs. I think Eldegoss is probably S tier support. She's great at supporting the team, and she's one of the best characters for it, I think. Next, we go on to Garch. Kind of been reworked a little bit. I think Garch can definitely start popping off now. I don't know if he'll quite be as high as something like Dragonite or something like that, but I do think he is still going to be pretty solid. For now, I might put him in B. I think he's going to be a solid choice, one that's kind of still a little high risk, high reward, because he does still kind of struggle early game a lot. So if you get snuffed out early game, it can be rough on a Garchomp to try to catch up. But I think his kit now really allows him to, once he starts going as Garchomp, to really start snowballing a lot better. Next, we got Gardevoir, and Gardevoir is pretty tight. She got big buffs a few patches ago, and then she got a little bit of a nerf, but I think she's still really solid as an attacker. I don't think she's quite up to Cinderace levels. Well, actually, she is really solid. She could output a lot of damage. I'll throw her in top of B. I think she's really solid. I think she struggles a little bit behind Cinderace, but I think she is a really solid choice. Next, we got Gengar. Gengar has had some weird changes to his kit. He's kind of had his moves kind of switched around as to what level he learns them at. I don't know if it'll be enough to make Gengar super great. I would wager to say he was one of the worst characters. Gengar is the one that I'm least sure about if he'll really be able to climb too much more than where he's already at. I would say Gengar, I might put in C. It's kind of yet to be seen what he can really do with his changes. I don't know if his changes will be enough to make him all that strong of a speedster. Next, we got Greedent. I would say Greedent is a pretty solid defender, a lot like Blastoise. He's just really great at staying alive, being a menace to the enemy team, and now there's even the meta going on where Greedent is a jungle stealing little guy. I would say he's probably high A. I would say he's probably still the best defender. Next, we got Greninja. I think Greninja and Cinderace are around about the same level. I think they both do their jobs really well as attackers. I think they're both great options. I don't think either one of them is way stronger than the other. I think they both kind of sit on similar playing fields. Next, we go on to Lucario. I would say he was S tier before. Now, I would probably say he's probably A tier. He has a lot of great moves in his kit that are just fantastic early game. Solo top lane Lucario meta I don't think is going away anytime soon. He might even still be S tier. It's definitely possible. And you know what? S tier is looking kind of lonely. Lucario could probably still pull it off. I think his solo lane meta will still be completely viable. It could be that he is in A. It could be, but he's really solid either way. I think for now I'll put him in S, and I might even throw Dragonite back up in S. I think they're still really great. Their kits are still super solid. They're not going to be OP, but I still think they are going to be really good picks. Next, we got Machamp, and Machamp got a few buffs as well. Machamp does have some added juice to his submission and dynamic punch, and I think they boosted his stats a little bit as well. I don't think he's going to be quite as powerful as the rest of the all-arounders up here, but I do think he's going to be really solid now. He was already pretty solid, but he was definitely lagging behind a lot of the other all-arounders, especially the two newest ones. Probably top of B, behind Gardevoir. They're going to be able to do what they do and do it well, but they aren't going to be as, like, powerful and as often a pick as someone like a Dragonite or a Lucario, or even now, I think Charizard is definitely going to start popping off a little bit more with his changes. Something like that, yeah. Next we go on to Mamo, and Mamo is pretty tight. I really like him as a defender. I think he's really started to improve. His Unite move is still a little lackluster, but I do really like the rest of his kit. He does a great job with pretty much any build on him. I would probably say he's up here in B tier. I don't think he's as powerful as the other defenders, but I think he's definitely come up a long way. Mr. Mime, I would say Mr. Mime. I think his strongest build is definitely his Confusion build with barriers, because the amount of damage he does with Confusion is just kind of nutty sometimes. I would say that Mr. Mime is probably, I'll put him as a B, top of B tier support. We might throw him in A. I'll keep him in B, because I would say, I could go ahead and do it now. Wigglytuff, I would say, is probably A little bit better than Mr. Mime, I would say. She has a lot more moves up her sleeve that really support the team. Her Unite move is great. Everything about Wiggly is pretty solid. I think both are still really, really solid, but I kind of see this being where they're at. Eldegoss top, Wiggly right behind, and then Mr. Mime behind, and then Blissey, unfortunately, at the bottom for supports. Next, we got Ninetales, and Ninetales, I think, is in a pretty decent spot. I would say Ninetales is solid, but not too OP. Ninetales definitely has a lot of pretty solid moves on her kit, but I don't think she really goes crazy. I would say she's probably somewhere in the low B range. She's solid. She's not one of the best attackers, but she definitely ain't no slouch. You can definitely get a lot done with Ninetales. I think Ninetales overall could use a little bit of a buff. She is still really solid, especially early on in lane. She could definitely help dominate with a good lane partner by her side. Next, we got Pikachu, and Pikachu could really dominate early on in lane, because if you put someone like a Snorlax or some defender or someone else who's really good early game with a Pikachu, they can really kind of wreak havoc up in top lane or bottom lane or whatever lane they decide to go with. Pikachu can do a lot of really great damage. It might fall off late game as compared to someone like Cinderace or Greninja, so that might drop it off a little bit compared to them, but I do still think that it is probably A tier. I would say it's probably, it's one of the best attackers, especially in lane. I would say in lane, it is by far the best attacker. But I would say Greninja and Cinderace probably outperform it in the long run. Next, we got Slowbro. And Slowbro, I think the Slowbro buffs that we got a patch or two ago really helped him to start getting a little bit more traction, a little bit more playable. Now that his Amnesia was buffed and he's just got a lot more survivability, and he's just got amazing CC ability with telekinesis and surf, just being able to really mess with the enemy team a lot and just help confirm kills on enemy teams, especially with his ult. I would say Slowbro is probably a high B. I don't think he's quite as good as the other defenders in A, but I definitely think he can really hold his own. Especially in a team comp, he can really be a great asset. Snorlax coming in. I think Snorlax pretty solid. I don't think he's super great. I don't think he's like popping off, but I don't think he's bad by any means. I think he might be... He may be one of the underperforming defenders right now, if you ask me. I think a lot of the other defenders are kind of starting to pass him up. A lot of the other defenders just have really great moves in their kit that just kind of outperform Snorlax a lot of times. I would say Snorlax is probably low B. I don't think he's bad enough to where he's unviable at all. He's not a C tier worthy boy. Other than Crustle, yeah, I would say all of the defenders are still in a really solid spot, even Snorlax, because they're all still really viable. Next, we go on to Sylveon. And Sylveon, I would say, might be one of the lower performing attackers. I really like Sylveon, but I think she needs a little something right now. I think she's a little underperforming. She's a little underpowered. I'll put her in C, because I think Ninetales kind of outshines her right now. Next, we got Talon. And Talonflame, unfortunately, did get a little bit of a nerf to the fly ability. Talonflame at least also got a buff to Aerial Ace, which is pretty tight. It now has a healing part of the move where it heals you a little bit when you hit it. So I would say Talon is still probably going to be likely the best speedster. I don't think she's really going to fall off too much. The fly nerf does hurt a lot, but I still think she's got a really great kit. She Fly is still going to be great. The damage was a little bit nerfed, and like I said, the cooldown was a little nerfed as well, but it's still going to be a great move, great amount of damage, and Brave Bird is still a very viable option. Aerial Ace with that buff might become, you know, the new hotness on Talonflame. And of course, Flame Charge, you can't really go wrong with it. It's just still a super solid move. I don't think the changes are going to be that detrimental to her. I think Zorora is right behind her, probably somewhere in A. I would think somewhere in there, maybe below the attackers, but still pretty solid of a choice. And then we got Trevenant. Trevenant is the newest boy, of course, and we've got the least amount of experience using him, but I will say I think Trevenant's kit is really cool. I think he will be very, very good at just kind of being a damage sponge, taking a lot of hits from the enemy and life stealing, keeping himself alive, and just messing with the enemy. I don't think he's going to be super OP, but I do think he will be pretty solid, and that's what I've heard from a lot of other people, is that doesn't seem like super strong, but he's solid. I could potentially put him low A. I think he's really solid. I think he might deserve it. Next, we got Serena. And Serena, another one of those all-arounders that was just really popping off. The changes to her kit might kind of knock her down a little bit because they nerfed her Grassy Glide and her Triple Axle, but they did buff Stomp, which is kind of nice. You know, a little bit of love to the other moveset that is a little less used. I think she's still going to be pretty solid. I think Serena is really just threatening overall. Even if her moves do get a little bit nerfed, I think she is super solid. I would say probably still S. I might say, not really sure where to put these three, just because they all did get nerfs, but they are still really solid Pokemon. Like, I don't think the nerfs are going to stop them from being very viable choices. And some of the best characters in the game. Maybe Lucario falls to A. Dragonite, I think, is still going to be pretty menacing with the Dragon Dance Hyper Beam build. Even if it's not quite as strong, I still think it'll be a really strong set of abilities. And I think his Unite move will still be pretty solid. Even if the recharge rate will be slower, I think just his ability to move across the map so quickly is still going to be a really good Unite move overall. And Serena, I think, has just been so menacing throughout the whole meta since she was released that I think her kit just works really well, especially now that Stomp's a little more viable. Stomp was already a really solid move, so now if Stomp starts getting used more, I could still see her being really threatening just with Stomp. And the Queenly Majesty ability is super, super great on her, letting her use her abilities basically twice in a row and do just really great damage and get some healing back in return from it. So I think Serena and Dragonite is still going to be pretty top tier. Even with some nerfs, I think they're both just such good Pokemon in this game. Then last but not least, we got little Venu. I would say Venu's pretty solid as an attacker. I don't think he's as good as the A tier boys, but I think he's a little bit better than the other attackers below. I would say probably top of B tier. He's not like the go-to attacker that I would say is like the best in the game, but I think he is still really solid. I think overall he performs really well, and I do think that the difference between A and B tier and even S tier aren't really all that huge. Right now I think the game is in a very balanced state, especially after the nerfs to Dragonite and Serena, and it was kind of tough to make a lot of these choices because of that reason. Like, everybody is so solid right now that it's kind of hard to choose who's really better than who, because they all can perform really well. But other than that, what do you think about this tier list? Where would you kind of rank some of the Pokemon? Specifically, where would you put old Trevi boy, the newest guy? Where do you kind of see him placing in the tier list? And I appreciate you hanging out. Take care of yourself, and I will see you around.